very impressive.
Could another way to address the potential class-based speciation be the education of the child, and by the principles of, let's say that over the last 100 billion people that have lived and died to build this beautiful world we live in today with all of the food and water ubiquity and the governments and the economies, that every child that's being stamped out into this world might have a little tiny missing chip on their shoulder. And that missing chip might be things like their parents explaining to them what evolution is, or what their anatomy, what their heart and their brain is, their body, maybe what morality is, things like that. If maybe every child was born with a little bit of something like that. Do you think there's something like that, Jordan?
Yeah, this, like that's done, right? This thing is connecting everyone to everything. And so the probability that people are going to get whatever education they want in the next 30 years is overwhelmingly high. So I think in some sense, that problem is being solved as rapidly as it can possibly be being solved. That doesn't mean people should stop trying to find more and more effective ways of educating. I think that would be really good.
Are there some general basic principles that you think a parent should teach a child, obviously within the rules of life, but it may be something about evolution or something about their own anatomy? And
well, I think that there are all sorts of things that parents who are good parents teach their children. I mean, part of what 12 Rules for Life is about that. It's like a universal ethic in some sense. I think that there's dawning realization among members of the biologically oriented community, let's say, that there is something like an emergent ethic that's evident in biological systems. And one of the most outstanding examples of that, I would say, is, apart from the work that DeWall has done with chimpanzees, showing the beginnings of an ethic, at least in the behavioral sense, the beginnings of an ethic among chimpanzees, is work that's been done with rats. And so Jaak Panksepp, for example, who wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which I would highly recommend. It's a real work of genius.
You blew my mind with Piaget, by the way, with the way that rats...
No, that's Panksepp. That
wasn't
Panksepp.
Piaget?
No, Piaget found that out in children. So Panksepp was the scientist who discovered that rats laugh.
That's right.
And you think, well, that's not a big deal. It's like, actually, it is a really big deal, because it shows commonality of the positive emotion systems across biological strata, essentially. So it's actually a really big deal. And he found that if you tickle rats with an eraser, they laugh ultrasonically.
Yeah.
And so you have to slow it down to hear them. And the reason he figured that out was because he was trying to figure out why, if you take rat pups away from their mother and feed them and give them enough water, they still die. So they die unless you massage them with, well, he used a pencil eraser. That's what, because it's kind of soft, it seems to work without harming the rats, little rat pups. And if you rub them with pencil eraser, then they'll thrive. And that was actually translated very rapidly into practical research, because it turns out that if you have a premature infant, it's in an incubator, they often lose weight, which is a really bad thing, because they're supposed to be gaining weight. But if you massage them 3 times a day for 10 minutes, then they'll gain weight about as fast as they do in utero, and they leave the hospital on average 5 days earlier, and the beneficial cognitive and physiological effects are still detectable 6 months down the road. It's a walloping effect. And so it turns out that one of the things Panksepp sorted out was that the touch is a human need. It's not a secondary need, it's a primary need, like food and water.
And childhood development.
Yeah. Well, and he was also a big proponent of rough and tumble play, because he found out that in rats, that rough and tumble play, especially among juvenile males, catalyzes prefrontal development, and that rat pups who are male that aren't allowed to engage in rough and tumble play show prefrontal hypodevelopment, and you can then treat them with Ritalin, which is the ADHD drug, just in case you're wondering. So that's a very dismal line of scientific research, but also very promising. So what Panksepp also found, and this is another piece of information that really blew me away when I first read about it, was Panksepp discovered the play circuitry in mammals. And that's also a big deal, right? That's like discovering a continent, and to discover a dedicated circuitry to a set of complex biological functions. That's a big deal, man. And so when he was investigating play behavior among rats, he noticed that juvenile males in particular would work to wrestle. And they wrestle really a lot like, well, human children, or like human children and dogs wrestle, and rats pin each other. So what Panksepp found first was that, and other scientists as well, but I'll use him as a shorthand, was that rats would work to enter a play arena where they knew they were going to be allowed to wrestle with a peer. And that's kind of how you figure out if a rat wants to do something, right? You make him button press for it or pull on something, and then you can measure how fast he'll press the button or how hard he'll pull, and you can get some estimate of how motivated he is. And rats are pretty damn motivated to enter into a play arena. And so if one rat enters into a play arena and another rat does, and the one rat is 10% bigger than the other, then in like 9 out of 10 cases, the big rat can pin the little rat. And in the first bout, then pinning establishes dominance. This is kind of an interesting commentary on scientific methodology too, because let's say that you were investigating rat behavior and you were trying to draw conclusions and you only paired rats together once. You'd assume the big rat dominates, its physical size that does the domination, and that's the purpose of play. But that isn't right, because
it's got to let it win every once in a while.
Well, play is something that iterates, right? You don't play with a person only once. You play with them, well, who knows for how long, right? If it's a relationship that lasts decades, then it's decades of reciprocal interaction. So Panksepp and his colleagues and the other scientists who were working on this paired the rats repeatedly. So these are iterated games. And the rules of an iterated game aren't the same as the rules of a one-off game. And that might actually be the basis for a universal ethic, is that there are rules for iterated games. And what Panksepp found was that, okay, so the big rat is now superordinate to the little rat. Now when you repair them, the little rat has to ask the big rat to play. That's the rule. So the big rat gets to sit there like he's cool, and the little rat has to hop up like a dog that's asking you to play and sort of bounce around. You all know what that looks like. Dog kind of puts its rear end up in the air, kind of hops a little bit, and that means like, well, come on, human, cuff me, you know? And if you have any sense, you know how to do that. And you can even understand when a dog does it. And the dog, if he's socialized, can understand when you're doing it, right? Because a well-socialized dog is, you kind of go like this, and then he does the same thing, and you whack him on the side of the head a little bit, and he growls and puts his, your hand in his mouth, but he doesn't bite it, but he sounds like he's going to. The dog knows what the hell's going on, unless it's raised by a behavioral psychologist, which is... Anyways, the worst behaved dog I ever saw was a dog that was raised by a behavioral psychologist. So anyway, sorry about that. But so you pair these rats together, and what you find is that, so the little rat has to ask the big rat to play, and the big rat will break his cool and then wrestle. And then if you pair them repeatedly, unless the big rat lets the little rat win 30% of the time, the little rat will no longer ask him to play. Yeah. Like, and I read that, it was like a little electrical storm went off in my brain.
That is what happened to me too.
Well, it's so good, so absolutely unbelievable. Is that, well, there you have it, it's emergent ethic of reciprocity. Yeah. All you need to do is pair animals together in reciprocal play bouts, and you have an emergent reciprocity. And then you think, well, okay, so that's the basis for social interaction, is that reciprocity. There's a bit of an advantage to the big rat, but not a huge advantage. Say, well, that's the beginning of an ethic. And you say, well, human beings, that ethic emerged at the biological level, and then human beings watched it develop and told stories about it. That's where the stories came from. And then out of the stories, we coded an explicit ethic. And that's where the philosophy of ethics came from. But it emerged from the bottom up. Something Nietzsche predicted like 150 years ago. He said, well, we'll find that there was an emergent ethic that emerged biologically and then was later mapped. And so that was just, well, that's just absolutely beyond belief. Yes. And very likely true, and points the way to something like, well, an archetypal ethic, certainly one of reciprocity, which is I think, the fundamental archetypal ethic. It's like